China to put its own astronauts on the moon.
China announcing this morning they plan to have astronauts on the moon.
China is shooting for the moon.
载人登月，
载人登月，
登月阶段，
载人月球探测，
载人登月，
载人登月。
载人登月, or crewed lunar landing. This expression is common with the Chinese leadership today, and for a good reason. In the next 7 years, China plans to land its astronauts on the moon. We're 50 years after the Apollo missions, and a decade of even greater ambition in space exploration, with both the United States and its partners, and China having set their sights on establishing a long-term presence on the moon. So what will this Chinese crewed lunar mission look like, and how does it compare with the Apollo and the Artemis missions? Let's cover this step by step. This episode was sponsored by Ground News. More on them later. First, some context. China's first real involvement in lunar exploration started in 2004, when the country's state council approved a 3-phase lunar exploration program called Chang'e. This was China's first real involvement beyond the Earth's orbit, and the missions would essentially be robotic. The Chang'e 1 and 2, launched in 2007 and 2010, were lunar probes which orbited and mapped the lunar surface. These were followed by the Chang'e 3 and 4, 2 missions which landed rovers on the visible and far side of the moon in 2013 and 2019. And finally, more recently, there's been the Chang'e 5 mission, which landed on the moon, collected, and returned 1.7 kilograms of lunar samples in 2020. In absolute numbers, this still pales in comparison with the number of missions from the United States and Russia, which pioneered lunar exploration, but from an achievement standpoint, it propels China into the forefront as one of the leading players, having achieved successfully orbiter, lander, rover, and sample return capabilities. These robotic missions will continue for the next 5 years. The Chang'e 6 sample return mission will launch in 2024, while the Chang'e 7 and Chang'e 8 will be technology verification missions in 2026 and 2028, exploring the concept of a long-term presence on the moon. But all of this is uncrewed lunar exploration, and in parallel, China is working on ways to send its astronauts to the lunar surface. Some of the early Chinese concepts for this came around the late 2000s and early 2010s. At the time, China was still developing its Long March 5 heavy lift rocket, and some of these early proposals included using up to 3 launches of a modified Long March 5. This then shifted over time towards the development of a new super heavy lift rocket, the Long March 9, a sort of Chinese SLS capable of putting 50 tons of payload on a trajectory to the moon. This rocket was envisioned with a total thrust at liftoff of nearly 6,000 tons. In other words, an absolute monster which would have been a real change of scale for the Chinese launch industry. But as we approached the late 2010s, it became increasingly clear that such a development would put Chinese crewed lunar activity way into the 2030s. And you have to combine that with the fact that at the time, the US was massively increasing its lunar ambitions under the Trump administration, launching the Artemis program and rallying an ever-increasing number of countries to the Artemis Accords. And also, the growing popularity of reusable rocket designs around the world was starting to make the Long March 9 look obsolete, even before it was developed. And so this is why over the past 3 years, China has decided to reshuffle its crewed plans entirely. On the one hand, you'd have the Long March 9, which would still be maintained, but redeveloped into this entirely new version, adopting a more distributed, fully reusable architecture resembling Starship, and which would be available sometime between the mid-2030s and early 2040s. But in the shorter term, however, China would develop a separate program to send 3 Chinese astronauts to the moon before 2030, and this is what we're going to get into now. To send astronauts to the moon before 2030, China needs 3 main components: a super heavy launch vehicle, a crewed spacecraft which includes a re-entry capsule, and a lunar module to land and lift off the lunar surface. This lunar rocket will be the Long March 10, a launch vehicle first conceptualized in 2018 and which is currently under development. In its heaviest lunar version, it is 90 meters tall and composed of 3 stages and 2 strap-on boosters. It will be able to send 27 tons into translunar injection, which is roughly half as much as the Long March 9, but 3 times as much as the Long March 5, and roughly comparable to SpaceX Falcon 9. But one major advantage of this rocket compared to the previous Long March 9 is that it uses existing Chinese space technology, and namely the YF-100 series Kerlox fueled engines, enabling the rocket to be developed in a much shorter time frame. This rocket will also be partially reusable, with the first stage and strap-on boosters taking an approach similar to SpaceX's Falcon 9, but also using an interesting tethered system to catch the rocket rather than using landing legs. This rocket is scheduled to debut in 2027, followed by a number of uncrewed test launches in 2028 and 2029. And this rocket is naturally a human-rated rocket, including a launch escape system, notably because it will be carrying the next big component of China's crewed lunar mission, the NGCS. The NGCS, short for Next Generation Crewed Spacecraft, is a sort of Chinese equivalent to NASA's Orion spacecraft. It has the role of carrying astronauts to lunar orbits and bringing them back to Earth. With a total mass of 22 metric tons, it is composed of two modules. You have a crewed module that can carry up to 3 astronauts during lunar missions, and this part of the spacecraft is reusable. It adopts the very familiar bell shape of most return capsules, which is optimal for atmospheric reentry on Earth. And then there's the service module, in charge of providing power and propulsion to the spacecraft, and as you'd expect, this part is expendable. The NGCS has been in development for quite a while. A scaled prototype was first launched in 2016 on board a Long March 7, followed by a full-scale version on the Long March 5B in 2020, which saw the capsule perform tests in orbit and successfully perform a re-entry. Now, this was not the final design by any means, and specifications have evolved since, so expect further test launches in the next few years, notably in 2027 and 2028. And last but not least, there's the Lunar module, which has the role of bringing the astronauts from lunar orbit to the surface and back to lunar orbit. This module is also currently under development and will have a total mass of 26 metric tons at liftoff. It is composed of the lander module at the top, which can host 2 astronauts, and the propulsion module at the bottom. Now let's look at the whole mission profile step by step. But before we do so, I want to mention a really great app that I've been using recently and developed by former NASA engineer Harleen Kaur. Ground News, who is also the sponsor of this video, is a news aggregator which enables you to easily visualize for any event the headlines of different media outlets reporting on it. This is notably applicable to space news, where you can review all the latest coverage from specialized outlets like Space News and Space.com, but also local papers which can provide complementary insights on local space programs. With Ground News, you can also get a more holistic perspective. Let's take the coverage of the Juche 2 launch in July, for example. You can see all the news sources covering the topic, keep an eye on their distribution on the political spectrum, and compare headlines to detect discrepancies in the way the event is presented. There are also tools to view the ownership of the media sources, as well as independent assessments of their factuality. We're in an era where algorithms increasingly tend to push outlets to sensationalize information to get more clicks. So if you're interested in facilitating your review of the world's news and staying informed in a rather unbiased way, I encourage you to check out Ground News. You can sign up or subscribe through my link at ground.news/Dongfang and get a 30% off unlimited access. And otherwise, thank you Ground News for sponsoring this video. And now back to China's crewed lunar mission. China's lunar mission will require 2 separate launches. The 26-ton lunar module with no crew would launch first on board the Long March 10 from the spaceport of Wenchang in Hainan. It would be injected into a lunar transfer trajectory by the rocket upper stage and insert itself into a lunar orbit with a deceleration burn. Next, the 22-ton NGCS spacecraft would launch with 3 astronauts on board. And just like the lunar module, the NGCS would launch from the spaceport of Wenchang on board a Long March 10 and insert itself into a lunar orbit. The NGCS would then rendezvous and dock with the lunar module using the docking mechanisms on both spacecraft. 2 of the 3 astronauts would then transfer to the lunar module, while 1 would remain in the NGCS. The lunar module would then separate from the NGCS and perform a deceleration burn. After this, the propulsion module would be discarded, and the lunar lander module would perform a soft landing on the lunar surface. This would be performed with the help of 4 retro thrusters, as well as a larger number of smaller attitude control thrusters. Once on the lunar surface, the lander would act as the living quarters to the astronauts, providing power and life support systems to sustain them for a short period. And as this would be the very first Chinese crewed lunar mission, the stay on the surface would be very short. We're talking 6 to 8 hours, during which the astronauts would be collecting samples and performing scientific experiments. The astronauts will have at their disposal a lunar rover, which will come attached to the lander and will enable them to evolve within a distance of 10 kilometers of the landing zone. Once the lunar surface tasks are complete, the Chinese astronauts would get back into the lander, which would then lift off, rendezvous, and dock with the NGCS spacecraft in lunar orbit. The 2 astronauts would then join the 3rd member of the crew, which stayed inside the NGCS, after which the lander module would separate from the NGCS and be discarded. Following this, the NGCS would fire up its engines to inject itself into a return trajectory to the Earth. The return capsule would then separate from the service module to perform an atmospheric re-entry, absorbing its kinetic energy through its heat shield and using 3 large parachutes to land, presumably at the Dongfeng landing site in Inner Mongolia. In many ways, China's first crewed mission to the moon resembles the Apollo program. First of all, from a weight perspective. The lunar module and the NGCS have a combined total mass at liftoff of 48 tons. This is similar to the 44 tons of the command and service module and lunar module of Apollo. In Apollo missions, 2 astronauts would also land on the surface, while 1 other remained in orbit around the moon. Also, both missions would provide astronauts with lunar roving vehicles on the surface with a similar mass of 200 kilograms. And finally, in both cases, the stays of the astronauts on the surface would be rather short. We're talking less than 24 hours. It's 8 hours in the case of the Chinese. It was 21 hours in the case of Apollo 11. Although it's worth noting that with latter Apollo missions, the stay was extended to up to 3 days. Of course, when you look closely, there are also some differences. NASA employed, for example, a single Super Heavy rocket, the Saturn V, while the Chinese used 2 separate launches of the smaller Long March 10. Also, Apollo's command and service module docked with the lunar module during translunar injection, while the Chinese lunar module and the NGCS will dock in lunar orbit. And finally, when departing from the moon, the Apollo program's lunar module was composed of a lander and an ascender, and astronauts would take off vertically from the ascender, leaving the lander on the moon. However, in the case of the Chinese mission, there's just 1 big lunar lander, which also acts as the ascent vehicle. Now, if we compare China's first crewed lunar mission to the Artemis program, then this becomes an apples and oranges situation. If we look at the landers, for example, Blue Origin's Blue Moon lander will have a launch mass of 45 tons, and the Starship HLS is supposed to have a mind-boggling 1,300 tons, and that's to compare with the 26 tons of the Chinese lunar lander. Now, as you may expect, China is also preparing an answer to Artemis, and it's called the ILRS, aka the International Lunar Research Station. So now let's see how all of this fits onto a timeline. On the Chinese side, the Chang'e 6 to 8 robotic missions will take place between 2024 and 2028, followed by test launches of the Long March 10, scheduled to debut in 2027. This will be followed by China's first crewed lunar mission to take place before 2030, according to the official timeline. And this probably means 2029 because this would be on the 80th anniversary of the People's Republic of China. And we know that the Chinese like to have spectacular events coincide with these special dates. On the Artemis side, the Artemis 1 mission, consisting of a test flight of SLS and Orion, took place in November 2022 and will be followed by the Artemis 2 lunar flyby missions in 2024 and the super ambitious lunar landings of Artemis 3 to 6, which will involve Starship HLS, Blue Moon, and the Lunar Gateway. These are for the moment still scheduled between 2025 and 2030, and there's also a number of smaller scale missions called CLPS or CLIPS, which will take place in parallel of all of these crewed missions. As mentioned earlier, China's longer term answer to Artemis is the International Lunar Research Station, a program so far composed of 5 missions and scheduled to take place in the 2030s, with the exact dates yet to be confirmed. We're not going to go into too much detail on the ILRS because that's probably a topic for another video, but suffice to say that China is also hoping to attract a slew of participating countries, and there have been many illustrations of this recently with the announcement of the establishment of the ILRS Cooperation Organization in April 2023, and the announced objective of signing intergovernmental accords by the end of 2024. In any case, the upcoming 10 to 15 years are going to be absolutely unprecedented in lunar exploration. And the fact that there are these 2 major initiatives in parallel, Artemis and the ILRS, this will create competition which will stimulate efforts on both sides, hopefully in a good way. As always, I want to thank my 27 Patreon and YouTube members for supporting this channel. If you enjoy this content and you found it useful, please consider joining our community and becoming an active supporter. Thank you very much for watching, and I'll see you next time.